Hi everyone, so this is the SCIM deep dive follow-up for APAC. My name is Cynthia Ng, also known as Arty Chan, a senior support engineer. And this is a follow-up, and you are expected to have already watched the recording from yesterday. Thanks everyone joining. So we're just going to do Q&A for this session and see what questions we can answer. Emily, I see you have the first question. Would you like to vocalize?
Yeah. Yep. So I was just reading the docs that you link in the issue, and I saw that there's a skim SSO for gitlabcom groups and saml ones, and I'm just wondering how different is it? Is it like the difference between .com and self-managed is like group level and instance level, or is there like more differences?
Okay, let me try to unpack that question just a little bit. I'll answer the easy part first, which is that SCIM right now is not available in self-managed at all. In the slides, I do have a link to the issue. So I'll just, I think, sorry, let me just find it. I believe it's on slide 3. So it's issue 12823. So that issue is kind of a bit general, but does refer to bringing SCIM to self-managed. Also talks about bringing LDAP to .com, right? So it's the issues, like the specific, there will probably be more issues for the specific parts created, but that is the only issue right now that we have that refers to bringing SCIM to self-managed. So I want to clarify that SCIM does not exist at all in self-managed right now. So it's only on .com. SAML is actually a different kind of feature part of the product. It is, of course, part of SSO, right? So just kind of briefly, the way that it currently is implemented is that the self-managed one and the kind of .com, the SaaS one, are two different features. They're both called SAML because that's the protocol they use, right? But in terms of how it's implemented, it's actually using very different things. So if you look at the self-managed SAML page, it uses certain gems and all this other stuff. I'm actually not even sure how much of the gems we're reusing for .com. And a lot of it is coded differently because it was specifically for .com and specifically for implementation at the group level. So we would always recommend that for customers, you're either looking at instance level for self-managed, and you have SAML, or in some cases, you can do it as omniauth, which is, again, a slightly different thing. The buttons show up in different places too. Through them. And you'd be looking at instance level configuration, GitLab RB. For .com, you are looking at implementation of tying your SAML and potentially SCIM app to a specific group in .com. Now, the reason why there's a reference to self-managed in the SAML for groups documentation is because technically it's possible to turn it on. There are feature flags around it, and so you can turn it on. You can technically get it working, but it's mostly for development purposes, right? And it's, I wouldn't say that it's fully functional for self-managed in the sense that it hasn't been really thought out for the user flow and how that would really work for self-managed. And I can imagine it actually being a nightmare to configure, because you can imagine that if you have a self-managed instance, if you're doing it at the group level, you have to have a separate SAML app for every single group. So if you have 100 groups, you have to have 100 SAML apps, and that doesn't make sense, right? So if you have a self-managed instance, it makes more sense to implement it at the instance level and then use groups in terms of access. Now, group sync is coming. So then you would use SAML groups to configure what level access people have when signing into SAML. Like when they sign into SAML, they get added to a group for the first time or something like that, or the instance. And then based on the SAML group, they would have access to certain groups in GitLab. So you can do that, and we have it for SaaS for .com already. So for .com, it's you configure SAML for your group, and then for specific subgroups, you can say, hey, if this user is part of this SAML group, they should have this role in this subgroup. So as a more practical example, like say you have in Okta, right? Say you have a support group, right? Within GitLab, right? So GitLab sets up, Okta for GitLab, and then they say, okay, you have access obviously to the GitLab group. But right now I think our default role is guest, right? And then, but you could say, hey, in the support subgroup, which we have, everyone in the Okta support group should have maintainer access. So you can set that up now. That's now available. But that has nothing to do with SCIM. That is specific to how SAML is implemented. And it has to do with the SAML protocol and group sync, which again is already available for .com and is coming, I think, in the next release for self-managed, at least planned for the next release for self-managed, will be available very quickly because self-managed has SAML. It's just they don't have SCIM. So SCIM is completely separate from everything that I just talked about. And there currently is no timeline for when SCIM will be implemented for self-managed.
Yeah, thank you. Now I have a clearer picture.
Yeah. So it is important to remember, like, I tried to, slide 6 is kind of where I tried to kind of separate it for everyone, and when I was talking about this during the recording too, that SAML and SCIM have two different roles. They're both part of SSO, right? And because they're both part of authentication and authorization, and helps to control what users have access to. But ultimately, SAML and SCIM have two different roles within what goes on in the system itself. And that's why, I was, want to reiterate that your SCIM extern UID can not match what is coming from your SAML, like from your identity provider, and you can still sign in. Because when it comes to signing in, you're only matching on the SAML identity. And as long as the SAML identity matches what your identity provider is sending, like say Okta, right? Then you can sign in, that user can sign in. So it's completely separate from the auto member management part of it, of automatically adding users and removing them. And that is what SCIM is specifically designed for in terms of the protocol and what it does. So it is two separate things. And that's why users, in a lot of ways, the users never really directly kind of almost interact with the SCIM identity, unlike the SAML identity, where like when a user signs in, GitLab is matching that against, Okta or whatever identity provider. The users kind of interacting with it in a way, in the sense that they trigger it. With Skim, it's never user triggered, right? It's purely system triggered. And it's purely for managing the addition and removal of users. Not to say that you can't manually remove users if you want to, you know, it does happen. Okay, Rodanak, you want to vocalize your question?
So we have like SCIM API for gitlabcom, and in the documentation, it's a update saml identity. So I find that a bit confusing because we have like saml identity and SCIM identity, and the doc is for SCIM API, but it's a update saml user. So is it for update?
You know, I never actually realized. I don't look at these docs, or I don't look at this docs page in particular very often, because you know how like we can't use the Skim API to get this information. So I rarely use this docs page, and I mostly I will point people to it, and you know, our other docs point to this page. But it's really funny because I actually never noticed that, and because we always have to use console to access the Skim identity. So it doesn't touch the SAML identity. As far as I know, it only touches the Skim identity. Oh, mind you, I think part of where this came from is almost like a legacy piece, right? So, okay, so we only implemented Skim identities in February, but we had Skim before that. So we used to only have one identity. We used to only have the SAML identity. And I think that's why it says SAML identity, because you actually could use the Skim API to edit the SAML identity in the past. But ever since, I think it was about February when GitLab, the dev team, product team kind of turned it on, we created Skim identities. So the Skim API is now only used for editing the Skim identity, and it's completely separate from SAML. So why don't we add that as, Duncan, if you can add that as an action item. Rotina, I don't know if you even want to do it, you can go ahead. Like basically you'd be just renaming SAML to Skim. Otherwise, I mean, I can do it too. We can work it out in the action items list. But yeah, I think that's just a legacy thing, and no one's just ever noticed and changed.
It makes sense, like the title say update a single SAML user, but it's on the Skim list, so it's kind of a bit confusing.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely think we should edit that. But yeah, it's a carryover from when we used to only have one type of identity. I really think that's just where that language comes from. I bet you if we pulled up the blame right now, that it's just that line has not been edited since the doc was created.
I'll create merge request for this.
Yeah, thank you. And I see you have another question. You want to vocalize that one?
Yep. So this is like more on the SAML side, because like on gitlab.com, like people would sign into a group and then they don't have to sign in for a while.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I was literally working on this like an hour ago. Okay, so yeah, so just to clarify, as you mentioned, this has nothing to do with Skim. This is purely a SAML thing, but is tied to SSO, right? Because of controlling user access. We actually, well, when I say we, I mean GitLab, a week ago turned on 7-day SAML expiry. I have the link handy and I will add it here. So we literally turned this on a week ago, and then we got a ticket in today, and was escalated to me, which is why I know about it. And basically it now, if you turn on SSO enforce, because it doesn't make sense if you don't turn that on, right? So in the case where someone turns on SSO enforce, then the browser session will force expire in 7 days, regardless of our browser policy, a browser session policy. Yeah, so we just turned that on a week ago.
So before it just stayed there forever, right?
Yeah, so it followed our GitLab browser session policy, right? So basically, as long as you kept visiting GitLab, it would auto renew your session, and you never had to sign in, right? So like right now, I'm sure, unless you go on vacation for a week or whatever it is, then because you visit GitLab almost every day, even if you're off for the weekend, you come back on Monday, your browser session is still there. Like you don't have to log back into GitLab, right? So what this does is that it forces it to expire after 7 days, regardless of what what the browser session policy is for GitLab in general, right? Which auto renews. This forces the browser session to expire after 7 days. So it forces the user to sign back into GitLab. And, the idea for most of these users is that they will be signing in through their provider anyways. So it shouldn't really change. What did change actually in this particular instance, and I can try to find the ticket to add to the doc as well, is that the customer turned on SSO enforce actually quite a few months ago. But before they turned on SSO enforce, they had added users to specific projects and subgroups. And so these users were manually added, were not signed in through SAML. But even after turning on SSO, or they might have signed in through SAML in some way or another, but after turning on SSO enforce, you're actually not normally allowed to add users to a specific subgroup or project without them being added at the top level group. But because these users were added both prior to that, and then they just kept using GitLab on a regular basis, they were never signed out. So it wasn't until their session expired this week that they then had problems signing in or getting access because they tried to visit a specific, say, project or subgroup. But because they weren't signed in with SAML and they hadn't linked their account through SAML, even if they were signed into GitLab, they couldn't access the group itself or the specific project or subgroup that they were added in. So what they have to do instead is they have to sign in through their identity provider so that they link the existing account to their SAML login, create that SAML identity, right? And then that should just give them access back to whatever they already had. At the same time, they would be added at the parent group level or top level group with whatever default role has been set, right, in the SAML settings. So that should be the resolution. We haven't gotten confirmation actually yet from this customer. Like I said, we've fairly thoroughly tested this with new users and adding new users, and we just, didn't exactly test with, hey, what if we manually add users, then turn SSO enforce on, then turn on the feature flag to have a session expire in 7 days. So if we absolutely need to, we can turn off the feature flag, but it's just a browser session expire. We think that as long as the user's properly connect their SAML identity, then they'll be able to access the group again. So yeah. The docs aren't updated yet. I actually, because this came up today, I've pinged the PM and the backend engineer and asked them about whether there's a docs update in progress. And if there isn't, then we'll create one. But we should be updating the docs, in the next couple of days.
Yep. Thanks, Cynthia.
All right, I realize we're actually just over time by like a minute or two. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you have any more questions, feel free to throw them in the doc or in the Slack channel. And I'm more than happy to answer them then. We do have another follow-up tomorrow. It'll be outside your time zone, but I'm more than happy to answer the questions in a recording then, or again through the doc or through Slack as well. So thank you for joining. Go ahead and stop the recording.